Today's video is going to be looking at the cult of Elizabeth, posing the question, what was the purpose behind Elizabeth's portraits? Elizabeth's glorious image was not just a matter of personal vanity. It was a sophisticated operation with a clear political purpose. The cult of Elizabeth was developed in order to make the subjects of Elizabethan society think of particular messages. It was a form of visual propaganda. Visual propaganda is something that we still do today. We do this through our social media. We try to create a deliberate image of ourselves. This might be through the choice of photo. It might be through the use of filters. We can also see it in other forms of life. This includes album artwork. This is the wonderful Newton Faulkner. If you haven't heard his music before, I strongly recommend you to have a listen to it. It is one of my favourites. But this is one of his album covers. He has deliberately selected this as his album cover and title. But we need to ask ourselves the question, why? Pause the video for a second and see if you can work out the message that Newton Faulkner was trying to get across to his potential audience. Some possible suggestions are these. His name on the top showcases his individual input into the album work. The amount of musical instruments on show might be an indication towards his talent, which is very, very high. The splattering of colour at the top shows the creativity involved in the creation of this album. And perhaps the small, intimate bedroom-style feel shows the humble roots of the artist. These are all forms of visual propaganda. Now, Elizabeth didn't have album artwork to do this with, but would achieve this through her portraits. Elizabeth's portraits were filled with allegorical symbols, hidden meanings. There were some constant messages in her portraits, creating the image of Gloriana, which literally means glorious ruler. These focused on her wealth, her purity and virginity, her strength, how she protected the country and sought to expand its territories further afield. For the remainder of this video, you're going to look at a series of Elizabethan portraits. I want you to look at the following portraits and take a moment to pause the video before moving on with each one. Can you spot the deliberate messages in each portrait? And make sure you note them down in your book. How would these images have strengthened Elizabeth's rule? Make sure you have detailed notes on the cult of Elizabeth. The first portrait to make a subheading of in your notes is the Phoenix portrait. Have a look at the image before some prompts will come up and see if you can work out the deliberate message that Elizabeth was trying to invoke through the use of the Phoenix portrait. Some questions to consider. Why would Elizabeth have a jewel of a phoenix around her neck? Perhaps research the mythical beast if you are uncertain of what a phoenix is. Why would Elizabeth have pearls around her waist? What can be said about her facial expression in this portrait? Take the moment to answer all of these questions in your notes about the Phoenix portrait. The next portrait we're going to look at is the Armada Portrait of 1588. Make sure you have a new subheading for the Armada Portrait 1588. Have a look at the image for yourself first and see if you can spot any of the allegorical symbols or hidden messages in this portrait. Some prompts to consider. Why would Elizabeth have her hand on the globe, especially pointing to the New Worlds and the Americas? What is going on in the background of Elizabeth's portrait? What can be said about her facial expression and the clothes that she is wearing in this portrait? Make sure you note down your ideas on the image that Elizabeth was deliberately constructing in this portrait. The final portrait we will look at is the Ditchley Portrait, which was painted approximately in 1590, near the end of Elizabeth's reign. Make sure you have a subheading of Ditchley Portrait. Have a look at the portrait and see if you can work out for yourself the deliberate images that Elizabeth is trying to construct. 3 areas of consideration again with this portrait. Why is Elizabeth stood on a globe? Her feet are deliberately centred on Oxford. What is suggested by the skyline in this portrait? And finally, why is Elizabeth so pale of complexion and dressed in a white dress? Make sure you've made notes on the Ditchley Portrait. So, our final considerations for this lesson. Hopefully you'll have an understanding that portraits were clever use of symbols to create a deliberate image of the Queen. Elizabeth was trying to reach to an illiterate society and as much of her subjects as possible. The cult of Gloriana was developed in order to make Elizabeth an object of worship, and this adds to the illusion that the Elizabethan times was a golden age for all. Thanks for listening. I hope you found this video useful.